Everybody. Happy Wednesday. I'm Eric Hargrove, and you're here with Amanda Marochko from Buffer, dear friend of ours, and we're super excited to be working with you guys. Um, Today, we are talking about um, what is it? We're talking about, well, since we're all remote or moving into remote or newly remote, we're going to be discussing with Amanda communication and productivity approaches to navigating current remote working needs. From what I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, Buffer's been a leader in the space of remote work, remote culture. So there's absolutely, in my opinion, no one better to have this discussion actually than yourself. So we're super happy for you to be here, and really excited to hear what you have to say. So without
Thank you so
further ado,
much.
I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. I'll just share my screen and then I'll just dive right into things. Perfect. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming out, taking time out of your day to join Webinar Wednesday, hosted by the team from Workfrom. Thank you to Eric and Jess for coordinating this. It's a pleasure to be a part of this. My name is Amanda Marochko. I'm originally from Canada, but I've been living in the Netherlands for just over 8 years now. So a little bit about me, I've recently joined Buffer as their head of strategic partnerships. And prior to that, I was working at a company called Shopify, where I led our international growth team for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Shopify back then was not was not a remote company, but I was leading a remote team that spanned multiple time zones throughout Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Since COVID-19, Shopify, like many other companies, has decided to go completely remote, a space that Buffer is very familiar in and that I'll be talking to you a little bit about today. So hopefully this isn't your first introduction to Buffer, especially if you work in the digital space, but in case it is, I wanted to give you a very brief overview of what we do. So at a high level, we're committed to creating content our business customers will find valuable. And what does that actually mean? Well, we're a social media optimization tool to help our customers and small and medium-sized businesses schedule content, engage with their customer base, and analyze their impact and reach. And why have we been asked to speak today? Well, Buffer has been seen as a pioneer in remote work. We publish a lot of content in this space on our blog, and we're very transparent with our successes and failures, some of which I'll be chatting about during this presentation. Oops, sorry. Oops. Remote work has been the norm at Buffer for many years now. We ditched our office in 2015 and have been hiring remote teammates ever since 2011. We now have over 85 teammates spread across 10 different time zones. Over the years, our team has experimented and learned tons of new things about productivity, tools, collaborating, communicating, and disconnecting, and how they each relate to remote work. So first and foremost, remote work under normal circumstances is very different from remote work under COVID-19. So if this is your first time actually experiencing remote work, please recognize that this is not the norm. This has been a very challenging time for our team members as well, even those who have been working remote for nearly a decade or more. We need to consider that for many people, it's their first time working at home with a significant other or a roommate also being at home. Many folks who work at Buffer also have to entertain and teach their kids at the same time. And many of us live in countries where you aren't allowed to leave the house without a note from the government. So all of these circumstances make for a much more challenging environment than would otherwise be a traditional working from home or remote setup. So that brings me to lesson number 1. Be more forgiving and understanding of your colleagues during this time. Allow them to work irregular hours to help their families. Understand that deadlines may need to be pushed back. It's really important for employees to maintain some sort of normalcy in their lives despite a global pandemic happening outside. And at the end of the day, their health and their families must come first. So let's dive into communication and collaboration. Communication and collaboration are very complex issues, especially for remote workers. Over the last 3 years, we've produced a state of remote work report every year, and communication and collaboration have been two of the top 3 struggles for remote workers. So this is a very important component of remote work. A big difference that I notice at Buffer versus many of the other companies that I've worked at is that we really lean into asynchronous communication quite a bit. So this concept simply means that work doesn't happen at the same time for everyone. Ensuring good asynchronous communication practices is one of the ways that we address this struggle at Buffer. So asynchronous communication can be an asset for remote teams for many reasons, especially if you have teammates in multiple time zones like us. We want to make sure that no one is excluded from important discussions and collaboration because of where they live or the circumstances that they have at home. Instead of relying on everyone being at home online at the same time, we try our best to communicate in a way that keeps conversations and decision-making open to all teammates, no matter where they are. And this can actually be an advantage for many countries. So as a distributed team across many countries, we use a number of tools to help us communicate effectively at Buffer. So over the past year, Threads has become a staple for us when it comes to effective asynchronous communication and collaboration. It has a clear purpose to make it easy to have text-based conversations across the company and clearly mark when decisions are being made. We don't have many meetings at Buffer, which I'm personally a big fan of, so we can really focus on getting our work done, and Threads helps us remove a lot of the noise from other channels. At my previous company, as I mentioned, I managed a remote team at a company that wasn't remote. And sometimes I would wake up to hundreds of notifications on Slack, and that is not even an exaggeration. There was a Slack channel for every product, pivot, or decision, and it was very difficult to find the important information. At Buffer, Slack is it's much more reserved for casual chatter, while Threads is a tool in which you collect feedback and where the decisions are actually being made. So I also used to have 8 hours of meetings back to back on Mondays alone. I found that, or I currently find as well, meetings disrupt productivity. So as much as you can do as much as you can asynchronously, and I would highly recommend trying it out and seeing all the benefits that really come from adopting this communication approach. We actually had the chance to catch up with the founder of Threads and asked him some very high-level insights on how to get the most out of this product and asynchronous communication in general. And these were some of his tips. Having clear processes and clear intentions. Communication stress grows exponentially the larger or more distributed you are. So with that, it's significantly easier to miscommunicate or misinterpret. It's important to have clear processes with clear intentions, which will reduce the amount of additional stress that you feel internally. Most things aren't urgent. Knowing the difference between urgent and important communication is crucial. Urgent communication will always be a fixture within the workplace, and products like Slack are actually a great fit for those types of communications. However, the more remote you become, the more you actually really need to lean into more thoughtful communication. Most things aren't urgent, but making them seem so will add a higher amount of anxiety, particularly to people who are originally co-located. Investing time in your writing. It's harder to be misunderstood when you write, and it gives people time to really think about what you said versus react immediately. So it's preserved for future generations of employees, forces principled thinking, and will reduce the back and forth. Taking the time to really write your thoughts and will refine them as they get jotted down, providing more context to others and catch people up to speed quicker, avoiding the need for a bunch of independent one-on-one meetings. So this is exactly why we lean so heavily on async communication at Buffer as well. And finally, I'll add one of Buffer's best practices as we've honed in over time as a team. Communicate everything up front. It's really easy and natural in an office space to walk up to a colleague and have a quick hello before asking them a question. Online, it makes more sense to communicate everything effectively and upfront, and not necessarily leaving a hello message dangling in time and space before relaying the rest of your message. So go ahead and give all of the information up front at once, defaulting to the idea that your teammate might be replying to you at a different time. So although we prioritize async communication at Buffer, that doesn't mean that we never have meetings or real-time communication. So how do you know what the situation calls for and what kind of communication to utilize? So for our team, we tend to use real-time communication for casual hangouts, catch-ups, or celebrations, urgent situations, relationship building. So one-on-one, one-on-ones or masterminds, which are pairings of people in similar disciplines, those types of things. But even under the best circumstances, real-time meetings can create communication that isn't as inclusive as we would like. It can be difficult for the whole team to to participate in and feel heard. So if one person dominates the conversation, it's harder for others to jump in. And if you aren't online or available for a real-time discussion, you're going to feel left out. And the team will miss out on all the context and insight that you could have provided. So yet another benefit of async communication is that it's actually more inclusive, both of time zone inclusivity, but also the way that people prefer to maybe communicate. It gives everyone a chance to reflect before they speak and communicate in the same way. It's not only the case for just remote work. Even if you were completely co-located at a company, you'd be surprised to learn how many people feel like they're just as unheard as someone in a completely different time zone. Oops. So lesson 2, lean into asynchronous communication as it will help you build trust in your team and allow you to get things done quicker. So I'm not going to go into every tool that we use since we only have a limited amount of time today, but Slack is one that the majority of us will be familiar with. As I mentioned earlier, I suffered from major Slack fatigue at my last company, and I think many of us on this call probably have. Buffer has introduced 10 Slack principles to help us optimize the use of this tool. So to preface this a bit, we do want to use Slack to communicate effectively and have fun as a team, but we don't want teammates to constantly monitor Slack after hours or get pinged at any hour of the day or night. So Slack is the right place for social conversations, interesting links, chit chat, questions or requests that need a faster or same day response, real-time conversations with those in your time zone, and async conversations with those outside of your time zone, sharing some quick praise, buffer love, gratitude, and achievements, passing along non-urgent need-to-know things. But Slack is not the best place for high-level discussions, making big decisions, or giving in-depth feedback. So these are some of the principles we try to adhere to. So first, you're responsible for managing your own downtime. It's important that people can talk to each other even when the recipient is not around. If we're each responsible for our own downtime, i.e. setting yourself up on do not disturb when you're offline or not working or not in the zone, controlling notifications on your phone if you choose to install Slack there, we give the rest of the team full freedom to communicate as they like. It's your responsibility then to deal with the message when you're ready. And a tip here is you can always mark a Slack message unread or to remind you so you can take any items that you need action on at a later date, and it'll remind you of that in Slack. So secondly, we try to default to public channels. So when in doubt, we always try to post a message where everyone can read it, keeping everyone updated on stuff that isn't private, of course. And we try to use our status and profile to communicate availability. So to share our status to let folks know when you're out sick or on vacation or just in a deep focus period. Additionally, Buffer's Slack profiles also include a lot of great information like time zone, typical sign-on and sign-off times, Calendly links, pronouns of choice, things like that. So making sure that yours is filled out will help folks understand how to best communicate with you and to check others as you work with them as well. Oops, sorry. Being deliberate about your notifications. So we recommend keeping Slack's recommended notification settings, only direct messages, the @yous, and highlighted words. These settings eliminate worry about missing important messages without your phone or computer going off all day and all night with less important conversations. Communicate proactively. When you ping somebody, go ahead and give that person the full context they'll need in order to get back to you when they can. So for example, no need to message, "Hey Joel," and then wait for a reply before saying more. Try to include links, docs, your deadline or desired response time, anything that can help move the conversation forward asynchronously. Threading when you can. So when you're having a discussion with many people at once, things can get a little confusing and ideas and opinions can easily get lost in the shuffle. So using threads on Slack, I know that's a bit confusing, can help you all keep up with conversations that you need to follow. And And this is one that a lot of us kind of adhere to as well, is to kill or modify Slack when you need to focus, which doesn't necessarily mean quitting it. You can set yourself to away or activate do not disturb, or set your status to a focus mode when you want to focus on something else without being interrupted. Don't keep checking messages in the chat system constantly. Having unread messages on Slack doesn't mean that you have to read them immediately. Let people get on with their work while you can continue on with yours. Save message checking for when you're out of your focus zone, and you can really devote time to going through all of them. So there's always a debate as well between @channel and @here. Including an @channel in a message will notify everyone that's in the chat room, but using @here will only notify the people that happen to be online at that moment. So for non-urgent announcements, @here is always going to be the best one. Use @channel and @everyone for emergencies only, because it sends a push and email notification to everyone, including those who may be offline or on vacation. And replying by the end of the day. So how fast should you expect a reply to a question or a request that you've made from a teammate on Slack? We try to adhere to that the mentality that you can expect a reply by the end of their normal workday, assuming that you've reached out to the teammate specifically by mentioning them or sending them a DM if the content is sensitive, that you didn't share a specific deadline, so always do this when you can, and that they're working a regular workday. So to check their status on Slack and Google Calendar are always a good ways to determine this. So lesson 3, to set boundaries and expectations from your comms tools. When everyone knows what the intended purpose is, it's so much easier to be productive and to find the right information. So, oops, sorry, I'm kind of struggling here with this. So we use a lot of tools here at Buffer, but these are some of the highlights. So, due to time constraints, I won't get into everything. You already know Zoom, as we're using it here today. Clearly the biggest celebrity to come out of COVID-19. Buffer used Zoom extensively before the pandemic, as did Shopify. And the reason it was our tool of choice at Shopify is because you could have a high number of people on the call and everyone can appear in equal-sized windows, which was important for team meetings and town halls in order to flatten any hierarchy that might exist. Notion may be a new one for you, but I think it's picking up a lot of momentum in the last few weeks too. Think of it as a place where you can store your employee handbook or any evergreen documents that you aren't likely to change very often. Zenefits is where we have all of our employee benefits laid out. I will talk about some of our benefits in the next slide, which you should maybe think about implementing. Okta and 1Password are pretty straightforward. Timetastic is a tool that allows us to see who's taking off time and when, so that it's a very transparent way to manage team availability. Culture Amp is a tool that we use to facilitate all of our internal employee surveys, which has also been very important during this time as well. Hey Taco, I will talk about on my next slide. And then Calendly, Trello, and Dropbox are also quite straightforward, but if you have any questions about these tools, I'm happy to dig into this a little bit deeper during the Q&A. So I wanted to talk quickly about my favorite Slack integrations because this can really help with productivity. So Hey Taco is a tool that we use to give gratitude. Very easy. So if you want to say thanks to someone for helping you out with someone, you simply add a taco next to their name on a public Slack channel. And Hey Taco actually keeps a tally of all of these tacos, and employees can redeem them for swag once they've reached a certain amount. So it's a great way to keep your team connected outside of the office, and a great way to just make people feel good for doing something nice and being helpful for something. So having managed a remote product team that spanned multiple time zones at Shopify, Geekbot was an easy way to communicate team goals to the wider company and really lean into the transparency side of things. I cannot talk enough about how I really love this tool. So every Monday morning, my team would get a ping from Geekbot, and they would answer questions such as, what is your main focus for this week? Do you have any new partnerships up to date? Is your country shipping anything, any new features this week? What are the data insights that you've gathered from the last week? Are you blocked on anything? Anything else you'd like to share with the team? It's meant to be like a high-level stand-up of what your team is working on so that other folks from different product lines or disciplines can jump in, ask questions, or simply just stay informed. And lastly, a tool that I use at Shopify as well, Fellow is an amazing tool that helped me manage all of my one-on-ones with my direct reports and also my leads. I would fill this out before every meeting, and my direct reports would also do the same. So it's important to always have an agenda of talking points before every meeting, and this allows you to track progress and action items rather seamlessly. So in order to get the most out of the meetings that you will have in your schedule, I would really recommend having a tool like this. So in short, there are a lot of tools out there, but don't be afraid to experiment with a small group or a team before rolling it out to an audience. So yeah, I would say test and iterate until you find something which works for you. Don't be afraid of new technologies out there, and you can always just start small and scale from there as well. So I quickly wanted to touch base on some of the perks that can help you and your employees during this time as well. So Modern Health is a tool that we offer Buffer employees. This can be seen as sort of a one-stop shop for mental health resources. Buffer pays for a few coaching sessions as well, so that's included in our perks, so that employees can use that as a resource whenever needed. So these can be, professional coaching sessions or also personal coaching sessions. So I think this is a great tool to offer your employees. Giving your employees a stipend to get started as a remote employee. So not every company is going to have $1,000 per employee to devote to this, but even having a fund where they can apply to get some expenses covered will help your employees become more productive. So Buffer offers a $500 startup allowance, and I personally purchased like a mouse, laptop stand, Bluetooth keyboard, and these noise canceling headphones now because my partner is also working from home, to become more productive and to focus on my work. So to have those benefits in place have been really valuable for myself. Oops. Many companies also have in-office perks such as free lunch, beers with the team, on Fridays, companies parties, all of these types of things. But because we don't have that in-person element, Buffer has a cool perk that is the gift of knowledge. So we can expense any and all books to Buffer, and they even give us a Kindle when we start. And I think this is a great way to show your employees gratitude while also giving them a gift that could pay off in dividends for your company. So professional development, I think, is always a great way to give back to your employees without and in return, it always gives back to the company as well. So another thing that Buffer really leans in on is experimenting with different structures to see what works best for our team. So we decided in March of this year to shift over to a 4-day work week with full salaries. So I know that's a bit of a controversial statement maybe, or a concept, but the sentiment was that with the state of everything that was going on with the world, it was becoming increasingly difficult to balance everything. And when we really believed in investing in the human side of work, that's our ethos, and we just could see that a lot of our employees were struggling. Many of our colleagues had children at home during the pandemic, and they now had to juggle their schoolwork with their own career. Some folks had family members at risk or were at risk themselves. Even though I don't personally fit into those categories, I found immediate benefits in a 4-day work week. So for myself, I'm super focused, way more focused during the week than I have ever been. I'm way more deliberate with my time, better at prioritization, and overall less stressed. Even though there's a global pandemic happening, I can truthfully say that this is the happiest I've ever been at work, and happy employees can bring their best version of themselves to work, at least most days. Although this may seem quite radical, Shopify also adopted this policy for the summer, and they're a company of 6,000 people. So I would say that if you're in the position to try experimenting with a 4-day work week and see the benefits that it could have on your business. So this brings me to my last point. Now is a very vulnerable time for everyone. So try to ensure that your employees feel valued during this time. It doesn't have to cost money. It can be a casual hangout online where people can just drop in and feel connected to the team, allowing for flexible schedules for your team members, integrating a system like Hey Taco to express gratitude. All of these things can be implemented to help your organization thrive during a time of uncertainty. So thank you very much for joining me today, and looking forward to having some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was fantastic. Like I'm a huge fan of tools and experimentation, and to know that that is, you know, broadly supported by Buffer, that's super cool. 'Cause you never know what's out there that somebody's gonna come across and be like, this is clutch for our team. So um,
Absolutely.
yeah, that was just phenomenal. Here's a question that we had. Um, how can non-execs or leaders in organizations help influence their companies towards more asynchronous works and fewer meetings?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the biggest thing that you can do is to showcase your own productivity through asynchronous communication practices and to
Hmm.
try to encourage experimentation within the parts of the business that you can actually control. So maybe it's just you and your team and your direct lead. So at Shopify, we had no meeting Wednesdays, which is a pretty low lift experiment that you can suggest doing. And I know at Amazon and other tech companies, in order to actually have a meeting, the hosts need to prepare a one-page document beforehand and everyone needs to review it. And I think this is a really important concept, especially for those recurring meetings in your calendar that are excluding one-on-ones, of course. But those can be a big productivity suck. So I think the biggest thing is to really focus on the things that you can control and showcase as like, these are tools or concepts that I'm implementing in my own day-to-day work and how they've benefited your productivity. And I think aside from that, the biggest thing is to have tools in place to support that. So otherwise, you're going to default to utilizing Slack more or email or Microsoft Teams, and that will also become cumbersome. So just having those systems in place to also balance that, I think, is also important.
Good points. Good points. Here's another one. Let's see. Somebody was asking about threads and
Mhm.
asking about the product Twist, and if you'd heard of Twist, and if you had any opinions on the difference between the two tools.
I actually haven't heard of Twist before, so I don't have an opinion on Twist, but I hadn't even heard of Threads before joining Buffer, and I think it's a new tool that's relatively picked up over the last few months. Um, but I mean, I'm a pretty harsh critic when it comes to new tools because you don't want to be that company that has 30 different tools. So for me, I was like, oh, that's another thing that you are integrating, but I've automatically seen the benefits. Once you really lean into it and you're like, okay, I like Buffer is a very transparent company. We over communicate a lot of things. Once you really lean into that ethos and you think, okay, you know, like for example, I joined the Twitter API conversation last night and it's like, okay, where would I post these few little action items? Like, you know, I'm going to put it on Threads. It's non-urgent, but it's just like a great place to have those evergreen high-level discussions so that the product teams know to prepare for API deprecation in 2 quarters from now. Like if I posted that on Slack, that would have been lost, like, and people would have forgot, you know. So this is like a very intentional channel for that. So for me, and I've had like really difficult conversations on Threads as well, where we had multiple stakeholders. We were making decisions on certain things, and being able to have that as like the unified source of truth to say like, okay, this decision's been made by these decision makers and these are the people involved in that conversation. I think it really ties everything in quite nicely. And of course they have a Slack integration. So if you really wanted to loop everything and notify people via Slack, that's also possible.
Yeah, I love the fact that Slack pretty much integrates with most stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, here's a question. Let's see. Here's another one. This is great. How do you make people that are outside of your working scope understand what remote work is? You know, there's a lot of folks that are new to this whole idea of like remote work, and I've been at an office all the time, and now I'm thrust into this space. But like, how do you make people understand that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a tricky one. I think there are always going to be jobs that require that in-person element, and I think of really tactile jobs in particular, like you know, construction and things like that. But the vast majority of careers in the tech space can be done remotely. So I would emphasize that remote work is just like regular work in many ways, but with more freedom and flexibility, and in most cases, higher productivity. I have many friends from very traditional careers like structural engineers, lawyers, and everything who were very skeptical of remote work at the beginning, saying, you know, this was definitely not for them. Their team would never be able to be successful. And then after a few weeks of adjusting, they're now dreading going back to an office. So I think remote work is just regular work. It's just like the components are just a little bit different. So like how the way you structure your day may look a little bit different. You're not necessarily taking the coffee breaks or necessarily having, you know, in-person meetings or things like that. But I think remote work and office work have more similarities and differences. So I think explaining it, and it's just you're just using different tools, and you're just having a lot more freedom to work in a way that suits you. I think those are the main principles.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Here you go. How does your team make decisions about new ways to support remote work or the remote culture that you have at Buffer? And does it happen organically, I mean, inside of the workspace, or is that something there's a lot of thought and process put into supporting the remote work and culture there at Buffer?
It's definitely something that we emphasize quite a bit. I mean, it's been one of our main principles since Buffer has kind of began, and I think the reason our team has been so successful has largely been due to it being a remote company first. So, I mean, we had some growing pains at the beginning, but I think now we see these as strengths, having remote workers from all over the world who have a very different background, who can add a lot of these different cultural values into the company. These are definitely strengths that we try to lean in on. Of course, there are always going to be challenges with that as well, like, the odd meeting that's maybe important meeting that's outside of your time zone or things like that. But for us, a lot of it happens organically, but it's something we're very intentional about. A lot of our, especially during COVID-19, we kind of had the spotlight turned on us a little bit, and a lot of companies were approaching us like, how did you do this? How did you structure this? Can you give us advice? And we're a very open company with that. So we've had a lot of meetings with other companies who are larger and smaller than us, who are just getting started, helping them to get up and running in a remote space. So for us, it's definitely part of our DNA, something that we invest a lot of time in, but also something that does happen organically at this stage, because a lot of the new tools and features that you see, or the experiments that we try, we have a very flat hierarchy. So a lot of these suggestions just come up through regular employees, and they say like, oh, I've seen this, or another company I know does this. Can we try it out? And usually our team is quite receptive to that. So so that's kind of, it's like a bit of a double-sided answer, but it's kind of a mix of the two.
Right. Do you have, when folks come into Buffer as new hires, or does Buffer have like a playbook or a handbook that you share with new teammates, and
Yeah.
that outlines the approach and whatnot that is there at Buffer right now?
Yeah, so we have like a resource manual that's personalized for each employee, and it's iterative. So like the next manual for the next new hire is going to look very different from what I got, because we're just constantly adding to it, which I think is great. It doesn't stagnate. So the manual that I received was like super extensive. It gave me an overview of like all of my like key contacts at the company. It had a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day plan for myself. I was assigned a role buddy at Buffer, so someone who was more intimately connected with my day-to-day work, and also someone who was helping me from a culture side. So they would help me, make sure that I was up to speed on our diversity values, or, other values that we held close to heart. So having these two people kind of alongside my journey for the first 3 months of the company were really helpful. And that document was very, very thorough. Lots of other like, watch this video, read this doc, complete this exercise. Like, it was very, very, and the first month was really just like on board. Like, don't focus on anything, but getting comfortable with Buffer culture and like understanding like the nuances of the business. Don't focus on your role yet, but having like the 30-day, 60-day, 90-day plan was also helpful for me to understand conceptually what I should be thinking of down the line. So I think having those documents in place are super important. And I think they do exist at non-remote companies as well. But now more than ever, it's really important to make sure that it's not just like this really monotonous doc that you're creating, to try to make it as dynamic as possible. Like, everyone has very different learning styles. So making it, as accessible as possible is really important.
And in the same vein, when you're hiring, are there time zone rules that the team or the organization adheres to, or do certain teams run on certain time zones, or is it just kind of open regardless of what the role is?
Yeah, it is open. So myself and one other person, we're part of the product team, but there's two of us who are in Europe, and then there's many of us on the West Coast of America, which are two kind of polarizing time zones. But we kind of adapt to it. We have later meetings on when we have our team meetings, and the folks on the West Coast of the USA have a bit of an earlier start to their day. But there are teams that have like a complete spread. So then they end up rotating the meetings. So half of their team will meet in an APAC friendly time zone and the other half will meet and they'll catch up asynchronously. So it just depends on the team. I think for some strategic hires, like really high level executive hires, we would try to make sure that they're not in a time zone that's completely opposite of their team. But for the vast majority of hiring, it would be, yeah, wherever you'd like. And a lot of folks get hired and then they say, I'm going to be a digital nomad for the next year or two or however long. And then, you know, they may be hired in New York and then before you know it, they're in like Bali. So you have to adjust with the times too. So, I mean, it's not very, you know, nowadays it's probably not as likely to happen, but hopefully in the future that will be a norm again.
Right. Absolutely. Derek, one of our attendees said, jump back to the Twist question. Twist is the Slack MS team. Let's see. Twist is the Slack/MS Teams developed by Doist.
I'm a big fan of Doist. So they're also a remote company, I believe. So I will definitely look into that.
New tools.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. How often does Buffer get their entire team together in person? I mean, aside from COVID, but like going into COVID, how often did everybody or teams get together? And then what did they do around that amidst COVID this year?
Yeah, so we were due to have our one big team retreat in Greece this year in
Oh,
June. Would have been really nice. It would have been just after I had started as well, or like shortly thereafter. So they aimed to have a one entire company wide retreat, and then the specific teams would meet up once or twice a year. So one time a year is more regional based, and then one time a year is like the entire product line or marketing team would meet up. So ideally 2 or 3 times a year in person. And now with us moving towards trying to make our retreat remote, it's actually going to happen next week. So it's still like, uncharted territory for us. We do have a remote town hall every month. So at least in that regard, we're still, connecting as a team at least once a month. But this week is actually going to be quite async. So there are going to be certain things that like team building activities that you can hop in and out of and join in with people from other teams, or like brainstorming sessions that are also going to be async. So it's going to be kind of a choose your own adventure type of online retreat, if you will, or I guess week together. So I think that will be a really interesting take on whether or not this could be a successful way to kind of meet asynchronously. So it's still early days for us. I'm sure if it's successful or really not successful, there will probably be a blog post about it on our blog. So we're very open with the things that don't work at our company as well.
no, that's great. I mean, it's awesome to know the amount of transparency that that the team has there at Buffer, and it's such a resource. We're actually planning here at Workfrom. We're actually planning our retreat, if you will, our virtual retreat. So there's been a lot of conversation around that, and it's a fascinating space to be in, where we're thinking about, okay, so we get what's possible with video. What else is possible as far as creating that experience, that human to human experience there that essentially transcends video, right? So
yeah.
I think one of the things we're looking at is an escape room. We're a pretty small team, so I don't know how that would work with a bigger team, but we're looking at a virtual escape room option.
Yeah, like those are great, I think, team building activities. And I think especially nowadays, to kind of boost team spirit and get to know people that maybe you don't work with on a daily basis, I think activities like that are a great substitute for the face-to-face meeting. So you'll have to also keep me posted on what you end up doing, because for us, it's, as I mentioned, very uncharted territory still, us dipping our toes in the water of what like an online like team building activity could look like for the week. So you should definitely keep us posted and we could share best practices after.
For sure. Here's another question. So this is a little more concrete than what I was going to ask, but you know, I'll ask both at the same time. What are some trends that you're seeing, or like if you're looking at remote work as it's moving forward, what are some trends that you see from the remote workspace or in the remote workspace, or that the team, the executive team at Buffer is kind of looking at as we move forward? And then the question that came in was, where will Buffer be with remote work culture in 2030?
Oh my gosh.
The crystal ball.
Yeah, it's so I think with us experimenting with the 4-day work weeks, I think that was a further step in this, like being able to manage your own time and having that trust with employees is super important. And I think a lot of remote first companies really, live and breathe that ethos, because you have to be able to, and a lot of traditional companies maybe are still getting used to trusting their employees working from a space where they can't be monitored. So I think the 4-day work week was very new to us, and we're now seeing a lot of companies following suit. So often we're the guinea pig, and then we see a bunch of other companies trying stuff out. So I think that's probably the newest thing that we've been experimenting with. And yeah, I don't know where we would be in 2030, but my assumption is by that time, remote work isn't like a taboo, and not that it's taboo, but it's still not seen as a normalized thing. I think a lot of people expect to go back to the office after all the dust is settled, they're ready to go back. Whereas my hope is that by 2030, this is just the norm, and that companies are able to hire talent from wherever they want in the world, that hiring, like legislation is easier in companies to hire freelancers, or that's always a tricky point, is like, how do I hire somebody in the Netherlands or in Canada without having a registered entity? So I hope by that time, it makes it a little bit easier for companies to hire remote workers in countries other than the countries that they're based in. And I would hope that Buffer is kind of a pioneer in that space too, since we're continuously experimenting with these things and continuing on with the transparency angle as well. And I think as time goes on, I would envision a lot of other tech companies to follow suit, since even Shopify, I mean, I was working there and they had said, we will never be a remote first company. That is never going to be the thing. And then, yeah, a year later, here they are saying, they're going to be one of the first big tech companies to really put their foot on the ground and say, we're going remote fully. So it's going to be a really interesting space. And I think, companies like yourself are going to be really important during that time too, since a lot of new companies are going to be navigating that space. A lot of workers will be looking for, space, how to optimize working habits for themselves independently. And it's going to be a really interesting time to be a remote worker. So my hope is that the tech hierarchy is a little like, things are a bit flattened at that stage. And, I would hope that our center of gravity is no longer like Silicon Valley, but, the world can have talent anywhere that they want. So that's my hope, at least. That's not necessarily a Buffer crystal ball, but more of an Amanda crystal ball.
I'll take it. I like it. No, and the whole idea of never say never, right? Like, we will never be remote until.
Absolutely. Especially, it was interesting having that conversation at Shopify, because I was managing a remote team, but there was this concept that like our engineering org could never be remote, because you learn so much being co-located and everything. And now that's not the case. And I think our engineering team are thriving, being able to like work from home at any hours that they choose. And, I think there's a lot of benefit to that as well. So I think employees in general are a lot more happy to be working from an environment that's more comfortable for them. They don't have to commute to work anymore. So especially in the cold Canadian winters, which are going to be around the corner soon. So.
Bonus.
Yeah.
Definite perk. Here's a question from Raj, who's watching today. Do you rely on any sync sort of workflows? Is it all scheduled meetings, or do you do unscheduled as well, like ad hoc discussions, or is the team too globally distributed for this?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of like ad hoc discussions. A lot of that takes place async on threads or something like that. But if there is a really key decision that needs to happen over a face-to-face conversation. That doesn't happen super often, but there are edge cases, like if you're hiring somebody and you need to just like quickly sync up, or there's a new product that's being launched tomorrow and you just want to make sure that all the, you know, T's are crossed and I's are dotted. So there are those like edge cases, but you know, the vast majority of teams, even our product teams, they have, you know, one sync as a team per week. And then they have their regular one-on-one with their lead once every 2 weeks. So their schedule is pretty open so that they can actually focus on getting stuff done. And then, you know, if there is the odd ad hoc meeting that needs to crop up, they have ample time and space to do so, instead of having pre-scheduled in meetings, which sometimes aren't necessary and aren't as productive as they should be. So yeah.
Okay, let's see if there's double check to see if there's any other questions. No, I think if anybody else has one, we've got a few more minutes to go, but if not, then we'll wrap it up a little bit early. Here's a question for you. What would you say is your favorite part about working at Buffer?
I would say, I don't want to say culture. That's so broad to say culture. But, you know, I think the fact that everyone is very, very open about, you know, having transparent values. And, you know, I've been in situations at previous companies where, you know, sometimes like people really leaned into like having conflict and things like that. I think in this environment, and being especially in a remote environment, things can get out of hand a little bit if like you're having conflict online. And I think people really over index on showing gratitude for one another. I think that's really important in this kind of space, to really say like, hey, I want to recognize that you helped me out on this thing. Thank you so much. Like, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to help me with this. And I don't think that happens enough. And I don't think that happens in in-person environments very often either. So the fact that it's like a very conscious decision that we at Buffer try to make is showing gratitude, and to be open and transparent about the things we're working on, and to really like lean in on those values. And that's, you know, it's not an afterthought. It's something that's really built into our DNA. And at first when I joined, I was like, oh, maybe these are just like things that they put on the website that, you know, maybe they're not actually adhering to. But then when you're here and you're working for the company, you're like, wow, they really believe in it. And it's such a refreshing experience, especially like I had joined at the end of February. 2 weeks later, we were in quarantine. So to see a company, you know, go through and how they handle a global pandemic, and then, you know, mass uncertainties throughout the United States. And like, there's a lot of different troubling times that were kind of impacting our company. And to see how our company was reacting to that, and how the leadership team was reacting to that, was really refreshing. So, and I don't think that's common all the time. So I think that's been my most positive experience working at Buffer so far.
That's fantastic. Well, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I have a last question. All of the things that you shared with us today were really great. Are there any guidebooks or playbooks that Buffer has available for folks that may be, you know, publicly facing, that maybe folks that are with us today might be able to check out, that will help them along in this kind of space?
For sure. So if you just go to our blog, it's been recently revamped, so I'm not sure where everything lives at the moment, but if you go to our blog, we have a whole section dedicated to remote work. We have our state of remote reports on our blog as well. But we also talk about various experiments on this blog. So like, we've tried a completely flat hierarchy before, where we didn't have any managers at the company, or like no direct reports. We've tried a lot of different things, some of which weren't successful. We have transparent salaries, and like how we adopted these types of policies as well. So all of these things we discuss on our blog pretty openly. So I would encourage everyone to have a look. And if there's any questions that you have, you can always reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only one with this name. So
you know what? There's one more question. It just snuck in. Do you have any important advice for a company that has been co-located and is now transitioning to distributed?
Yeah, I think that transition period is always a difficult one. So I would recommend figuring out what kind of communication cadence works best for your team at that stage, because they're used to seeing you probably every day, multiple times a day. So I think during that transition process, maybe having just a quick 15-minute catch up at the beginning of the day, just making sure that everyone feels motivated and ready to work. And if they don't, also just being accepting of that it's going to be a transition process for them. So I think slowly adopting or removing some of the in-person traditions that you have and transitioning, making sure that it's not like a overnight thing, like, oh, one day we're in-person company, the next day we're remote, because that's going to be a big overhaul and may not be well received. So I think making it as smooth of a transition as possible, and slowly introducing new tools into the mix and trying, and if things don't work, don't be afraid to say like, okay, we tried it, it didn't work, and then pivot on to the next thing. So don't get hung up on failures either, because it is a process. And I think there are a lot of mistakes that we've made as a company, a lot of mistakes I've made as an employee managing remote teams as well, and things that haven't worked. And, I would say that trust is the most important thing. And obviously you've hired your colleagues or employees for the right reasons. So just making sure that you trust them during this time as well, and being able to trust that they're going to find their footing eventually, and supporting them with whatever resources that they need in order to be successful as well.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for being here with us on Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was a pleasure.
It's been phenomenal. And if there's anything else we can do, what's your Twitter handle?
So it's just at Marochko, my last name, which is a bit complicated to spell. But if you look up Amanda and Buffer, I'm the only one with that name who works for Buffer, so it should be easy to find. But feel free to reach out or follow me or continue the discussion on that channel, because I love chatting with people about remote work. It's a passion of mine. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Will do. Thank you so much, Amanda. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.